It's time for Talking Pints. I'm joined by Dr. Sohom, and he joins me here on the show, and he's got a job I can't imagine doing. Now, as a consultant forensic psychiatrist, and you're the first psychiatrist we've had on the show, I've been much too frightened to invite any before, but your job, going into prisons, you know, this is the high security end, and you're dealing with murderers, you're dealing with some of the most dangerous criminals in this country. And I understand, looking at your background, that you didn't get off to a very auspicious start on day one.
Yeah, so I wouldn't want to contribute to the stigma that people that have mental illnesses are dangerous, because categorically the vast majority of them are not. But I didn't help that preconception by being punched on my very first day on a medium secure unit. Yeah, this gentleman had a mental illness. He had a delusion about me. He thought I was an old school bully in disguise. So because of his delusional beliefs, he preemptively struck me on the side of the head. Yeah.
When you're dealing with these people, and they've committed horrible crimes, you know, the worst crimes in the country, do they all have mental illness, or are some of them actually quite rational human beings who just decide to do something nasty?
So that is a complicated question. If I was to simplify, I would say that there's two ends of the spectrum, right? So on one end, you've got people with pure mental illness, typically something like schizophrenia or bipolar. And if their symptoms are so severe that they're not in control of their actions, so if they are having auditory hallucinations, hearing voices, then I think it's fair to say that they're not criminally culpable. On the other end of the spectrum, you have people with personality disorders. So that's different from a mental illness because it's far more ingrained. So the personality disorder I see the most is antisocial personality disorder. People who lack empathy, who don't care about the rights and wrongs of other people. So those people.
And are they criminally insane?
So I would say the ones on the first end of the spectrum that have severe mental illnesses that are not in control of their actions, I wouldn't use that term, but yeah, they're mentally disordered offenders.
Yeah.
The ones on the other end of the spectrum who do know what they're doing, they're a lot more difficult to rehabilitate, and they're far more in control of their actions. Yeah.
Those with severe mental illness, and this fascinates me. I mean, up to 40 years ago, 50 years ago, people with extreme mental health conditions we put in institutions, and they were left there for the whole of their lives. And it was a pretty unpleasant, pretty brutal thing to do, but the rationale behind it was that it protected the rest of society. Now, with care in the community, as it's been called, it's had various names over the decades, we don't believe in doing that. And yet I saw a figure a couple of years back that over 100 people a year are murdered by people who've been let out of prisons or institutions who clearly still have mental illnesses. Impossible question to ask you, but an important question. How do we draw the line on this? How do we deal with this? Is this current policy better than the old one?
Well, I think it definitely is better than the old one, because it gives people a chance at rehabilitation and redemption. And treatments have moved on, medication has moved on. The ability to make people less dangerous is far more available now than it ever was before. I suppose the problem is that as a forensic psychiatrist, when you're treating somebody in prison or in a secure unit, you have to eventually make a decision to discharge people, right? You can't keep them in indefinitely. It's not humane, and it clogs up the system for other people that need treatment. The question is, how do you know they're safe? And all you can do is go with the evidence in front of you. So you give lots of different therapies, you look at their behaviour on the wards, whether they're pushing boundaries, you test them on leave. So you have to make that decision. And sometimes the person in front of you seems stable at this point, and then after discharge, there's so many destabilisers in the community, access to victims, access to alcohol and drugs. So you can't always predict what's going to happen.
That must make you feel awful sometimes.
Well, I suppose I try and focus on the positive. So I think of the far larger proportion of people who we do make stable, who came in very dangerous, completely psychotic, suffering from these symptoms, who don't go on to commit violence. And also, I believe in the system. I trust in the system. Even though we're not going to get it right every single time, we manage to improve the futures of many, many people.
Rehabilitation. I mean, let's take the case of, somebody who has sexually assaulted and murdered somebody. Can someone like that ever be rehabilitated?
I think so, yeah. From my clinical experience, it's possible. It depends on so many factors. If it was, as I was talking about before, directly related to symptoms of mental illness, and if you can treat and remove those symptoms with the right medication, right rehabilitation, then that person is safer at the point of release. If it's something to do with their cognitive distortion, so if they have these really maladaptive beliefs such as, for example, that women are pieces of meat, or that they're entitled to sex. That's much, much harder to treat. It is possible, but you need to have a level of insight and cooperation from the patient themselves.
How do we compare with other countries? Do we have more people in these secure units? Do we have a higher crime rate? Are we pretty much the same for other European-style countries?
I think the UK is especially adept at rehabilitating mentally disordered offenders. Some other countries have systems, so America's a very good example of this. They tend to concentrate too much. I think they focus on just detaining people. So there's very little resources, time or effort to try and rehabilitate them. So you get this massive incarceration of the general population. You have all these people backed up in prison with no chance of becoming less dangerous.
It is extraordinary, isn't it, that America is 5% of the world's population, but 20% of the world's prison population. But that's what the Americans have voted for. And I guess in a democracy, that's what you have to have. But your point about rehabilitation, I suppose the general public are quite sceptical on this point. How do we convince them?
Well, I think they're sceptical because you hear the horror stories, as you mentioned before.
You hear the bad stuff.
The bad stuff, when patients are released and go on to commit serious violence and even kill. That does happen. I'm not denying that it happens. But you don't hear about, the hundreds of more patients that are successfully rehabilitated. But to answer your question, Nigel, I think it's all about trying to open the doors and tell people what actually goes on in these units. I think forensic psychiatry is a very closed world. There seems to be a layer of secrecy. I'm
learning now about it because I already discussed it. And you've written about all of this in your book, In Two Minds. If we look back at the 20th century, two of the biggest, and actually of themselves, most damaging political philosophies, one was based on nature. One was the National Socialist idea that who you are, how you behave, everything was about your biology, your race, your genes, your makeup. That determined absolutely what you would be and who you would be. And then we had the other ideology of communism, which is that's got nothing to do with it. It's all about nurture and it's all about environment. As I say, both of them, in their own way, led to some pretty appalling stuff happening in the 20th century. But particularly when you deal with these people who've done these terrible things, for whatever reason, which of those two factors do you think is the strongest?
I think any psychiatrist would have to answer that's a combination of two. It's nature and nurture. Having said that, I think that the nurture is the part that me as a forensic psychiatrist can deal with. That's the part we can assess. Those are the risk factors that we can potentially change. You can't really change nature. So even though they're both as equally as important as each other, the focus of rehabilitation has to be nurture rather than nature.
The Home Office has been criticised on the cross-channel crossings, criticised in so many areas. Not fit for purpose was a phrase used about it many, many years ago. You are dealing in the end ultimately with the Home Office. How are our prisons being run? How are they being staffed? What condition are they in?
So I don't think it's any secret, Nigel, that the prisons are at breaking point. And it's all to do with funding. Everything's to do with money and funding. So,
well, is it to do with funding or how the money's spent?
Well, I think the two of them are connected. The number of prison officers per capita or per prison population is decreasing almost on an annual basis. I think it's very variable between different prisons and how they're managed and how well they're run. But you have some prisons where the inmates seem to be taking over control. And you can barely have enough staff to actually do the day-to-day care, let alone the psychiatric rehabilitation that they need. So I think that's one of the biggest problems in prisons, yeah.
It's no wonder, really, that in your spare time you write fiction and short stories. Is that your big escape from this? I mean, are you able to leave this job and leave it behind you, or do you bring those problems home with you?
I definitely think that I've got an innate ability to kind of detach myself, compartmentalise what I see in the horrific crimes that I see on a day-to-day basis. I think there's a number of reasons. I think it's my natural personality. I think I'm so busy with other things, media ventures, YouTube channels, writing books. But also the throughput of my cases is massive. So by the time I've finished one report, I'm already have 2 or 3 others lined up.
So there's no time to think?
No time to perseverate over the horrible things I see.
But have the odd drink now and then?
Of course.
Sohom, thank you very much indeed. Not just for joining me on the show, but for what you do. That is terrific. Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.